3 hours ago, the world changed quietly but permanently. In a sealed room somewhere between Africa, Arabia, and Asia, three pens met the same page and the sound of their signatures echoed louder than any bomb. No NATO observers, no Western approval. Just men and women who finally decided to stop asking permission to exist. For 70 years, we were told this moment would never come, that Saudi Arabia must obey, that Pakistan must bend, that Africa must remain grateful, silent, and divided. But tonight those chains snapped. A defense pact binding Africa, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia has just been signed. And for the first time in modern history, an alliance powerful enough to stand without Western supervision has been born. In Washington, phones are ringing off the hook. In Brussels, ministers are demanding explanations. And on television screens across the world, headlines scream the same word, unthinkable. Yet, here we are, unthinkable no longer. The West calls it dangerous. But for billions who have lived under their boots, it feels like freedom. Because this isn't just a military alliance, it's a declaration, a rejection of dependency, a statement that three continents once exploited will no longer kneel before those who called themselves protectors while playing masters. So tonight, as the world's most powerful generals scramble to rewrite their playbooks, one question stands before all of us. Is this the birth of a new world or the beginning of the West's greatest panic? If you believe that history belongs to those who dare to stand without permission, stay with us. Because what began 3 hours ago may define the next 100 years. Please share if you believe this alliance marks the dawn of true independence. Subscribe if you believe that the truth deserves a louder voice than the empire's narrative. They said it would never happen. For decades, NATO built an invisible wall around the world not to defend, but to control. Every alliance had to pass through Washington. Every military agreement needed Brussels' blessing. Every defense plan had to serve someone else's interests. Saudi Arabia was told its survival depended on American bases. Pakistan was warned its stability required Western approval. And Africa was told it could never defend itself without foreign peacekeepers. But tonight that narrative collapsed. 3 hours ago, a treaty was signed that no Western diplomat saw coming, a defense pact linking Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Africa, the first of its kind in modern history. The meeting had been planned for months in secret. Trade conferences masked as cover stories, diplomatic exchanges hiding encrypted meetings. Even intelligence networks failed to detect what was unfolding. When the final signatures were placed, Western agencies realized too late that history had outpaced them. Those inside the room described silence so heavy it felt sacred. Not a victory parade, not defiance. Something quieter, deeper, the sound of independence being reborn. Saudi Arabia entered the pact carrying the weight of wealth, oil reserves, global influence, and the financial backbone to sustain a regional military force. Pakistan brought its battle-hardened army, nuclear experience, and geographic reach across Central and South Asia. Africa, from Burkina Faso to Senegal, from Niger to Tanzania, brought what money could never buy: the courage that broke colonial chains, the resilience that endured centuries of manipulation, and the youth that refuses to kneel. Together, they didn't just sign a piece of paper, they forged a message. We will no longer rent our security from those who profit from our fear. The pact details include joint military training, shared intelligence systems, and continental defense corridors linking African bases, Pakistani command centers, and Saudi funding channels. It establishes mutual protection clauses declaring that an attack on one will be treated as an attack on all. Western leaders immediately labeled it a destabilizing threat. But inside the alliance, it's being called something else: the Declaration of Independence for the Global South. Because this time, defense isn't about missiles and borders, it's about sovereignty. Imagine Pakistani engineers building radar networks on African soil. Saudi military funds strengthening African air defense systems. African troops training alongside Pakistani officers in Riyadh. Every partnership, every handshake rewrites decades of dependency. And when the cameras finally caught up, it was already too late. CNN broke the story with disbelief. BBC called it a seismic geopolitical shift. Le Monde warned of a shadow alliance forming outside NATO oversight. But their outrage only confirmed what the pact's architects already knew: the monopoly of Western security was over. In Washington, emergency sessions were called within the hour. Senators demanded intelligence briefings. European generals scrambled for answers. How could this have been kept secret? Who approved it? Who led it? The answer was simple: no one in the West. That's what made it historic. For 70 years, defense cooperation had been the West's favorite leash aid, disguised as control security, disguised as submission. But this alliance turned that leash into a sword. When the ink dried, one sentence from the declaration stood out: our defense will no longer depend on those who once invaded us. That's when the realization hit NATO's worst nightmare wasn't war. It was irrelevance. Tonight, the alliance between Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Africa stands as both shield and signal, a shield against external manipulation and a signal to every nation still waiting for permission to stand up. Because this wasn't the birth of aggression. It was the birth of balance. And the world will remember the night when three regions once bound by empire finally decided to defend each other not under NATO's flag, but under their own. The first sign of panic came within minutes. In Washington, lights flickered on across the Pentagon long before dawn. In Brussels, NATO's Situation Room filled with shouting voices, maps sliding across glowing screens, intelligence officers refreshing reports that made less sense with every update. For the first time since the Cold War, the alliance that once dictated global security had lost control of the narrative. CNN called it a dangerous escalation. BBC called it a blow to Western stability. But behind closed doors, military analysts used a different word: unthinkable. Because the unthinkable had just happened, three regions long considered clients of Western defense systems had chosen to defend themselves together. Within an hour, American senators demanded emergency briefings. Within 2 hours, European foreign ministers were on the phone with Riyadh, Islamabad, and Ouagadougou. Within 3 hours, NATO's Secretary General called an extraordinary session asking one question that no one could answer: how did we miss this? Their panic wasn't about the signatures, it was about the precedent. For 70 years, NATO's dominance wasn't maintained by firepower alone, it was built on psychological obedience. The world believed that security outside NATO was impossible, and now that myth had been shattered in real time. The reaction spread fast. Western media outlets tried to frame the alliance as provocative, illegitimate, or driven by anti-Western ideology. But the louder they shouted, the more their fear showed. Because deep down they knew this pact didn't threaten peace, it threatened hierarchy. In a quiet speech broadcast from Ouagadougou, one African leader summarized it perfectly: they fear not our weapons but our unity. Meanwhile, social media exploded across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Hashtags like non-end of NATO and not New World Alliance trended globally within hours. In the streets of Islamabad, students waved flags bearing the words "Brothers in Defense." In Riyadh, mosques echoed prayers of gratitude. In Burkina Faso, crowds gathered outside government buildings chanting, "We are no one's protectorate." But the Western response grew darker. Economic advisors in London and Paris proposed targeted sanctions. Think tanks in Washington drafted plans to contain the emerging bloc. Leaked memos revealed discussions about suspending arms sales, freezing investments, and launching informational campaigns to discredit the alliance. In short, the old empire was waking up to a new reality, and it didn't like what it saw. Still, the alliance's architects expected this. They knew that the first counterattack would come not from missiles, but from microphones, disinformation, character assassination. Divide and conquer, the same tactics used to dismantle unity movements for centuries. But this time something was different. This time the people were watching. The pact had not only been signed by generals and ministers, it had been witnessed by millions who streamed the announcement online. Every accusation of aggression was met with footage of handshakes, not tanks. Every warning of destabilization was countered by the image of leaders promising cooperation and respect. And when NATO spokespersons appeared on television insisting that regional security requires Western coordination, even Western citizens began asking why. By nightfall, a senior European diplomat reportedly slammed his desk and muttered the words now echoing across think tanks: "We've lost the narrative." Because in truth, NATO's fear wasn't military, it was existential. For the first time in generations, the Global South wasn't reacting, it was acting. It wasn't begging for inclusion, it was creating its own system. The West called it a rebellion, but to billions watching from the sidelines, it looked like justice finally taking form. And as one African commentator put it, his voice trembling with conviction, "They used to decide who could defend whom. Now we decide who deserves to be free." That night, While Western generals drafted responses and strategists weighed retaliation, the rest of the world saw something they'd been told was impossible: independence without permission. And that realization, more than any weapon or speech, was what made the world's most powerful alliance truly afraid. Beyond the headlines, beyond the panic in Western capitals, something quieter and far more powerful began to unfold. It wasn't the sound of armies mobilizing, it was the hum of ordinary lives beginning to believe again. Because this pact, though signed by leaders, was never meant for politicians alone. It was written for the worker in Ouagadougou who sells crops for prices set by European markets. For the teacher in Karachi who sees her students denied visas to study abroad. For the engineer in Riyadh who dreams of building technology that serves people, not profits. For them, this alliance changes everything. In Africa, it means no more peacekeeping forces that guard gold mines while villages remain unprotected. It means that when Burkina Faso or Niger face an external threat, their defenders will be African, not foreign contractors wearing blue helmets. It means that resources, gold, oil, cotton, will be defended by those who live on the land, not those who exploit it. In Saudi Arabia, it means no more financial blackmail. For decades, Washington held the kingdom's assets hostage under the guise of security cooperation. But with defense now shared across continents, the United States can no longer threaten to freeze what it cannot control. Saudi wealth will finally serve Saudi and allied interests, not the comfort of Western banks. In Pakistan, it means no more IMF prescriptions disguised as aid, no more being forced to choose between rival superpowers while their citizens starve. With Saudi funds, African markets, and regional partnerships, Pakistan can now invest in self-sufficiency, energy industry, and defense on its own terms. This alliance doesn't just rewrite treaties, it rewires hope. Already, Pakistani engineers are preparing to collaborate on African infrastructure projects, roads, railways, digital corridors. Saudi universities are opening exchange programs for African and South Asian students. African doctors are being invited to train in Riyadh and Islamabad under new public health initiatives free from Western gatekeeping. Even in classrooms, something is changing. For the first time, students in Lagos are studying defense strategies written by African and Asian generals, not Western historians. Textbooks are being revised to reflect the heroes who resisted empire, from Thomas Sankara to Muhammad Ali Jinnah, instead of those who served it. The political ripple effect is equally profound. Countries long pressured to choose sides are now watching a third path emerge, one not aligned to Washington or Beijing, but to their own people. Leaders from Southeast Asia, Latin America, and North Africa have already hinted at interest in joining similar frameworks, and in the streets, conversations are shifting. In Nairobi cafes, young people debate how their nations can contribute. In Dakar University, students hold seminars on strategic independence. In Islamabad Friday, sermons echo the words, "Unity is defense." But the West, watching all this, sees danger because the most powerful weapon ever invented by empires wasn't the bomb or the dollar. It was division, and that weapon is losing its edge. Still, the architects of this pact know the battle isn't over. They expect propaganda, sanctions, sabotage, all the old tricks. But this time, they also know that every attempt to punish one nation will only strengthen three. Every sanction will deepen solidarity. Every insult will echo as proof of fear. Because the real victory of this alliance isn't military at all. It's psychological. It's the moment billions realize that sovereignty isn't granted, it's reclaimed. And for the farmer, the teacher, the mother, and the soldier across 3 continents, that realization is worth more than any weapon NATO ever built. In Washington, they called it a geopolitical earthquake. In Brussels, they called it a threat to world order. But in truth, what they feared wasn't war, it was irrelevance. For decades, the Western alliance built its power not merely on military strength, but on the illusion that no nation could survive without it. That illusion died 3 hours ago. The signing of the Saudi-Pakistan-Africa Defense Pact cracked open the foundation of NATO's monopoly and left the guardians of the old world order scrambling for meaning. Behind closed doors, U.S. senators demanded intelligence on how it happened. Was Russia behind it? They asked. Did China fund it? They couldn't imagine that nations long treated as dependents could cooperate on their own initiative. The very concept of self-determination, when practiced outside Western frameworks, felt like a betrayal. The Pentagon's briefings were laced with alarm. Analysts warned that the pact could redefine global security architecture. Translation: Washington no longer gets to approve who defends whom. Across the Atlantic, European leaders panicked for another reason. France and Britain, once colonial masters across Africa, realized that their last threads of influence were slipping away. If African armies could be trained by Pakistan and African infrastructure financed by Saudi Arabia, then Paris and London's post-colonial leverage would vanish. And yet, in living rooms across America and Europe, ordinary citizens began asking the question no politician wanted to answer. Why is it dangerous when others unite but stability when we do? Even some Western commentators dared to admit what their governments wouldn't, that the global South wasn't rebelling out of hatred, it was reclaiming dignity. Still, official Washington chose confrontation over reflection. Think tanks proposed countermeasures, economic sanctions, currency manipulation, democracy, promotion operations designed to fracture the new bloc from within. The same playbook used in Libya, Iraq, and Syria was being dusted off again, but this time it wouldn't work so easily, because this alliance wasn't built on fear of the West. It was built on freedom from it. Elsewhere, the world reacted differently. In Beijing, cautious admiration. In Moscow, quiet approval. In Delhi and Brasilia, analysts whispered that the global South is becoming a pole of its own. Even nations in Eastern Europe and Latin America, long trapped between Western influence and local frustration, saw a mirror of their own struggles for sovereignty. Meanwhile, African and Arab diasporas in the United States watched the Western response with mixed emotions. Some felt pride, others felt worry. But all sensed the same truth: something irreversible had begun. Because at its core, this wasn't about weapons or territory. It was about who gets to define legitimacy. For the first time, nations once labeled developing were developing systems that no longer required approval from those who used to rule them. For Washington, it's the end of unipolar comfort. For NATO, it's the start of strategic humility. And for the world, it's a glimpse into a future where power no longer flows from empire, but from equality. The United States now faces a choice: will it adapt to a world of equals or try to destroy it again? Because if history has shown us anything, it's this empire's fall, not when they're defeated from outside, but when they refuse to believe the world can exist without them. 3 hours ago, the world crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. And now the silence inside Western war rooms is louder than any siren. They're studying maps, analyzing signatures, and drafting countermeasures. But what they're really trying to understand is how power slipped through their fingers, not with a war, but with a handshake. Because what happened wasn't just the signing of a Defense Pact, it was the birth of a new psychology. For centuries, the West defined what was possible, who could rise, who could speak, who could defend. But tonight, that monopoly ended. The age of obedience is closing. The age of equality is beginning. Still, the danger remains. The empire does not surrender quietly. They will threaten sanctions, spread disinformation, and fund division. They will call unity aggression and independence instability. They will try to paint freedom as a threat to peace. It's the same strategy they used on Sankara and Nkrumah Gaddafi, leaders who dared to dream beyond Western permission. But this time it's different. This time Africa is not alone. Arabia is not alone. Pakistan is not alone. Together they've built something greater than armies: an idea. An idea that nations once exploited can write their own rules. That sovereignty isn't charity. That defense is a right, not a privilege, granted by empires. And that idea, once awakened, cannot be bombed, bribed, or silenced. As NATO generals whisper about containment, people across 3 continents are whispering something else: hope. Hope that the world can finally move beyond domination. Hope that children born in Ouagadougou, Riyadh, or Karachi will grow up unafraid of foreign dictates. Hope that this time independence will not be stolen, but protected. The next few days will reveal much. Will the West accept a new balance or repeat the old cycle of coercion and control? If they choose confrontation, they may spark a conflict they cannot contain. But if they choose humility, the world may finally breathe. Because history won't remember their threats, it will remember our stand. And so we end where we began. 3 hours ago, the chains broke. 3 hours ago, sovereignty became contagious. 3 hours ago, the world changed. Now the question isn't if they'll respond, it's how we'll endure. Share this if you believe the future must be written by those who live it. Subscribe if you believe that truth, not power, should guide the world that's coming, because this is not the end of a story. It's the beginning of a world finally standing tall, from Burkina Faso to Riyadh, from Islamabad to every corner of Africa, a world where the name Ibrahim Traore will forever stand for one word: freedom.